By May 1945, the Waffen-SS numbered nearly 900,000 men. They were the ideological fanatics of the Third Reich, guilty of the worst atrocities in human history. Yet when Germany surrendered, this massive army didn't just disappear. Some faced the hangman's noose, but thousands vanished into ordinary lives, foreign armies, or secret intelligence networks. Before we expose exactly where they went, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second and helps us uncover more history the textbooks leave out. Now, we track down the missing legions of the SS. The final days of the war saw a frantic shedding of skins. As the Red Army smashed into Berlin, elite SS officers tore the silver runes from their collars and burned their paybooks. They knew what was coming. Soviet commissars were shooting SS men on sight, often without even a show trial. To the west, the situation was only slightly better. American and British troops, who had just liberated camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, were in no mood for mercy. The result was a wave of suicides using cyanide capsules, but for the majority, the goal was simple: blend in. Men who had commanded tank divisions became simple Wehrmacht privates or farm laborers. They relied on the chaos of a broken Europe, where millions of refugees clogged the roads to slip through the cracks. The feared Black Corps had dissolved into a desperate mob trying to hide the blood-type tattoos inked under their left arms. The legal hammer came down on October 1st, 1946. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg didn't just convict individual leaders, it put the entire organization on trial. The verdict was devastating. The judges declared the SS a criminal organization, meaning that membership alone could be grounds for prosecution. This stripped away the just following orders defense forever. The Allies made a distinction that would have massive consequences later, however. They separated the Allgemeine SS, the political administrators of the Holocaust, from the Waffen-SS, the combat units. Both were condemned, but this slight legal gap allowed veterans to later claim they were just soldiers like any other. In 1946, that distinction meant nothing. Being identified as SS meant automatic arrest, internment camps, and, for many, a fate worse than death. For those with too much blood on their hands to hide in Germany, the only option was escape. The Ratlines began here. A network of sympathizers, corrupt officials, and Vatican clergy helped top-ranking Nazis flee Europe. They traveled over the Alps to Genoa or Rome, obtained Red Cross passports under false names, and boarded steamships bound for South America. Argentina became the primary sanctuary. President Juan Perón actively recruited these fugitives, valuing their military and technical expertise. In May 2025, the Argentine government finally declassified over 1,800 files, confirming the state's organized effort to harbor these men. Figures like Adolf Eichmann and the camp doctor Joseph Mengele lived openly in Buenos Aires for years. They hosted social clubs and maintained their ranks, believing the Third Reich might one day rise again from the jungles of South America. No story illustrates the bizarre post-war reality better than that of Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando. The man who rescued Mussolini was acquitted of war crimes in 1947 and escaped captivity the following year. He did more than hide, he thrived. Skorzeny settled in Spain, under the protection of dictator Francisco Franco, becoming a successful businessman who sold arms and consulting services. A shocking turn came in 1962. The Israeli intelligence agency Mossad recruited him. The Jewish state hired a high-ranking SS officer. They needed him to target German rocket scientists working for Egypt. Skorzeny assassinated fellow Germans on Israel's behalf, reportedly to keep his own name off the Mossad hit list. He died of cancer in Madrid in 1975, a millionaire who had played every side against the middle, never spending a single day in prison for his wartime actions. Joachim Peiper was the poster boy of the Waffen-SS, young, ruthless, and charismatic, famous for the Malmedy massacre, where his men gunned down American POWs. Peiper was initially sentenced to death. In a controversial turn of events, his sentence was commuted, and he walked free in 1956. He tried to reintegrate, landing a job at Porsche and later Volkswagen, but his past always caught up with him. Eventually, he moved to a recluse life in the French village of Travis. This quiet life did not last. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day, a group calling themselves the Avengers firebombed his house. Peiper refused to run. He grabbed a rifle and waited. Firefighters found his shrunken, charred body the next morning. It was a brutal, vigilante end for a man who had escaped the hangman's noose for 30 years. A persistent legend claims that the French Foreign Legion in Indochina was essentially the Waffen-SS in different uniforms. Books like Devil's Guard popularized the idea of entire SS battalions fighting the Viet Minh. The reality was more calculated. The Legion did recruit heavily from crushed Germany. Up to 60% of legionnaires in Indochina were German. But French recruiters were strict. They physically inspected men for the telltale blood-type tattoo under the left arm that marked a Waffen-SS member. If you had the ink, you were rejected. The SS were masters of forgery, however. Many removed the tattoos surgically or used the chaos of 1945 to create false identities. The Legion was not an SS army, yet hundreds of hardened veterans slipped through the net, trading the frozen steppes of Russia for the humid jungles of Vietnam, fighting and dying for a country that had conquered them. As foot soldiers fled or faced trial, the officers with technical degrees found a red carpet waiting for them. The Cold War was starting, and the United States needed an edge. Under Operation Paperclip, American intelligence agencies bypassed President Truman's explicit anti-Nazi orders to recruit German scientists. The most famous was Werner von Braun, an SS Sturmbannführer who used slave labor to build V-2 rockets. He did more than survive. He became an American hero, designing the Saturn V rocket that took humanity to the moon. He was not alone. Hundreds of engineers with SS affiliations had their records scrubbed. They were given new lives in Alabama and Texas. The moral compromise was absolute. The US government decided that winning the space race and beating the Soviets was worth overlooking the SS lightning bolts in a scientist's personnel file. In West Germany, the survivors didn't stay silent. In 1951, they formed HIAG, a lobby group for Waffen-SS veterans. Their goal was audacious. They wanted to rebrand themselves not as war criminals, but as ordinary soldiers who fought an anti-communist crusade. They published magazines, held reunions, and lobbied the government for military pensions. They had success. Because the new West German army needed experienced officers, politicians initially courted their support. HIAG managed to blur the lines of history for decades, pushing the myth of the clean Waffen-SS. It wasn't until the 1980s that public opinion truly turned against them, and the federal organization didn't dissolve until 1992. For 40 years, men who had guarded camps and burned villages organized openly in the heart of democratic Europe. One of the strangest twists of the post-war era happened right at the Nuremberg trials. As top Nazis were being judged inside the Palace of Justice, the perimeter was guarded by men wearing American-dyed uniforms who had been Waffen-SS soldiers just months earlier. These were the Baltic legions, Latvians and Estonians. The Allies decided these men were distinct from the German SS, viewing them as conscripts fighting for independence against the Soviets rather than for Nazi ideology. Labor Service Company 4221, for example, consisted of former Baltic SS men, now paid and fed by the US Army. They guarded the very trials that declared their parent organization criminal. It was a pragmatic, if hypocritical, decision by the US military, which needed manpower and saw these anti-communist veterans as useful assets in the occupied zones. The 14th Waffen Grenadier Division, known as the Galicia Division, was made up of Ukrainian volunteers. Unlike the Germans, they weren't sent to camps or ratlines. Instead, thanks to Vatican intervention and British pragmatism, they were transported to the United Kingdom and later Canada. About 2,000 of these men settled in Canada in the 1950s. The logic was that they had fought against Russia, not the Allies. But this decision planted a time bomb that exploded decades later. In September 2023, the Canadian Parliament gave a standing ovation to 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka, a veteran of this very division. The subsequent global outrage forced the Speaker of the House to resign and highlighted how the West's "enemy of my enemy" policy in 1945 had allowed thousands of SS-affiliated soldiers to live quiet, honored lives in the democracies they once opposed. Across the Iron Curtain, East Germany claimed to be the ultimate anti-fascist state, purging all Nazis from society. That was merely the propaganda. The reality was far darker. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, actively recruited former Gestapo and SS men. They valued the ruthlessness and interrogation skills these men had honed during the war. West Germany allowed veterans to form lobby groups, but the East blackmailed them into service. If an ex-SS officer wanted to keep his past secret and avoid the Gulag, he became an informant. It was a brutal transaction. The communist regime used the very men they publicly demonized to build their own surveillance state, proving that for the totalitarian mind, a skilled oppressor is always useful, regardless of the uniform he used to wear. Not everyone got away. Governments lost interest. But individuals like Simon Wiesenthal and Beate Klarsfeld refused to forget. They tracked fugitives across continents, keeping the pressure on lethargic prosecutors. Their greatest victory was the capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960, snatched from a Buenos Aires street by Mossad agents. His trial in Jerusalem broadcast the reality of the Holocaust to a world that had tried to move on. For every Eichmann, there was a Gustav Wagner or an Alois Brunner who died in bed. The hunt was often frustrating and lonely. These Nazi hunters worked against statutes of limitations and indifferent officials, driven by the belief that time does not absolve genocide. Their work ensured that even those who escaped the hangman lived their final years looking over their shoulders. This story did not end in the 20th century. In 2024 and 2025, German prosecutors were still dragging centenarians into courtrooms. The legal precedent changed in 2011, allowing conviction for simply being part of the camp machine, without proving specific individual murders. This led to the indictment of men like Gregor Formanek, a 100-year-old former guard at Sachsenhausen. In 2024, courts debated whether he was physically fit to stand trial for aiding in over 3,000 murders. These final trials are symbolic. The defendants are frail men in wheelchairs, hiding their faces from cameras. Critics ask what the point is of jailing a 100-year-old. The answer from the prosecution is simple. There is no statute of limitations on mass murder, and justice, however delayed, must still be spoken. Beyond the individuals, the Waffen-SS left a military legacy that Western armies quietly adopted. The camouflaged uniforms used by every modern army today were pioneered by the SS. The concept of the assault rifle, exemplified by the STG-44, was also developed for their divisions. Even the tactical doctrine of mobile aggressive defense influenced NATO's planning against the Soviet Union. Western military academies studied battles like Kharkov and the Ardennes, separating the military genius from the atrocities. It was a dangerous sanitization. By focusing on the tanks and the tactics, military historians often ignored the fact that this military efficiency was driven by an ideological fanaticism that regarded the enemy as subhuman. The Waffen-SS didn't just survive in hiding. Fragments of its DNA were absorbed into the very military machines built to prevent another world war. The uncomfortable truth is that most of the Waffen-SS got away with it. Of the 900,000 men who wore the runes, only a tiny fraction faced serious justice. The leadership was hanged or committed suicide, and the most notorious were hunted down. But the vast rank and file simply went home. They became teachers, engineers, police officers, and politicians. They raised families in the Europe they had helped destroy. They benefited from the Cold War, from the need to rebuild, and from the world's desire to forget. The organization was destroyed, but the men survived, proving that history is not a moral fable where the wicked are always punished. Sometimes, the villains just fade into the crowd. The disappearance of the Waffen-SS wasn't a magic trick. It was a collective failure of justice driven by political convenience. From the jungles of Argentina to the rocket labs of Alabama, the victors found uses for the vanquished. Today, as the last of these men die out, we are left with the files, the graves, and the lesson that evil doesn't always end with a surrender ceremony. If you want to support our research into these dark chapters of history, please like and subscribe.